the 12th chapter. And in his teaching, Jesus said, "Beware of the scribes, who like to walk around in long robes and like greetings in the marketplaces, and have the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at feasts, who devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation. And he, that is Jesus, then sat down opposite the treasury and watched the people putting money into the offering box. Many rich people put in large sums, and a poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which make a penny. And he called his disciples to him and said to them, "Truly I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who were contributing to the offering box. For they all contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on." The gospel of the Lord. The gospel text for this morning is for anyone who is feeling vulnerable, perhaps due to loss of a loved one or some other loss of some kind. It's for everyone. The gospel's for all of us. But it's particularly for the vulnerable this morning. Widows and widowers. But a widow is put in front of us this morning. And widows in the Bible time considered the most vulnerable. I think we have widows and widowers here this morning. Paul, who read the lessons to us this morning. Or excuse me, not Paul, Ron. I think of Barb Poulter, Trudy, Karen, Ann, and Mike. I think of Mike because he came up and gave me a hug this morning and said a prayer for me, as he always does when I preach, and I'm most grateful for that. Though I have experienced some loss in life, I think particularly, my parents, we watched my mother and my father lose power over time, and eventually were laid to rest into the arms of their Savior. And I watched that happen. But I feel humbled in many ways by this topic, the profound depth of sadness, isolation. I have not experienced that yet. So if my illustrations seems a little hollow, particularly those of you who have experienced that kind of loss, you know why. But it's also why I am not going to rely on my own understanding, but I'm going to adhere very closely to the Word as much as I can to expose you to the wisdom of the Word, and particularly the wisdom of the cross. And so Jesus says, "Truly I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the offering box. For they all contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty has put in everything she had, all she had to live on." Did you ever wonder what sustains the widow? What, after she gives her last 2 coins? Everything she had to live on, into the temple treasury. What is the end of the story? As Paul Harvey would say. Some of you know who I'm talking about. We're going to answer that question this morning, but before we get to the rest of the story, we need to start at the beginning. Let's start with the scribes and a few observations by Jesus. First, there is a difference, hear me, there's a difference between sham piety and the true faith of the heart. There's a difference between sham piety, sham righteousness, and the true faith of the heart, as there is a difference between gold and fool's gold. One has great value, and the other, at best, is a curiosity, but of no lasting value. The tricky part of today's gospel is that we see piety, which we often associate with faith, but it is a sham piety, and it is not the true faith of the heart. Now, how do we know this? How are we to recognize this distinction and know the difference between the two, between sham piety and true faith of the heart, that we might be spared or saved from our failure to see how it operates in our lives and its devastating effects? Number one, we recognize the false piety of the scribes in its pretense or show. The Greek word, some of you are studying Greek, process. It's a big show. It is a feigned righteousness. And the problem with this is that the substance of this show, or rather the lack of substance, will become apparent as the scribes and as we approach the cross. And as we experience the implied loss of the trappings of authority and honor. We are now in the gospel at the end of chapter 12, and we are about to turn the page to chapter 13, which begins with what has been called the mini-apocalypse. Jesus was with his disciples in there near the treasury witnessing this widow, and he gets done with his lesson, and they walk out, and the disciples look around and say, wow, this temple's pretty nice. Wow, look at how big the stones are. And then Jesus says, do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. And unfortunately, with the arrival of the Romans who were not happy with insurrection, that happened. There is loss here, and not only for an individual, but for an entire culture and people, as well as a loss for the worshiping community. And then in the very next scene, Jesus is sitting at the Mount of Olives with a few of his disciples overlooking the city of Jerusalem, considering its future and his future outside the city wall on the cross. And it's not hard to imagine, is it, that disciples saying, Jesus, can we go back to that last thing about the temple? When are these things going to take place? So as we, the disciples, the scribes, and everyone begin our path to the cross, the substance of these false pieties and the pretense of faith will be exposed as such. And they all fled. The gospel tells us. 2. But not only are these false pieties, these false faiths exposed for what they are by the cross, they are made as refuse, like trash, in the light of the resurrection. Why have the fake article, a cheap knockoff, when you can have the real deal? 3, those who live with false pieties like to walk around in long robes, symbols of authority and power. They don't just do it by accident, walk around in long robes. They want to do it. There's something wrong with not just their behavior, but their heart. They desire, they plan, how am I going to do this? And Jesus notices. We don't require much more description. You've seen it before, I suspect. 4, those with sham piety, without true faith of the heart, live for greetings in the marketplaces. Well, it's nice to be recognized. But these guys notice when that recognition has been missing for a while and they want it back. 5, they like the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at feasts. 6, they devour widows' houses. Now, I'm not sure exactly what that means. I don't think it's literally. But it doesn't sound good, does it? I was reading different commentaries on this, and there were some people who were thinking that maybe this was a kind of extortion. Like fundraisers, go knock on the houses of vulnerable and say, hey, would you mind just signing your house over to us when you die? You won't miss it, So I got a feeling that it may be a little something like that. It takes a lot to support this fancy lifestyle, don't you know? And 7. 7's good biblically. I don't have any more. And for a pretense, for that, they make long prayers. Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, when you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites. For they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, and that they may be seen by others. Truly, I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you pray, go into your room and shut the door. And pray to your Father who sees, who is in secret, And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Jesus summarizes, beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by him, for then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. There's a difference between piety, or appearance of piety or righteousness, and the true faith of the heart. A sham piety will not hold up as one approaches the reality and exposure of the cross. The pretense will lose its ability to support life. And it will not be sustained. How are we to know the difference between false piety and the true faith of the heart? By study and reflection? By book learning? Well, yes, that helps. But more importantly, you will learn this by experience. We are collectively and individually on our way to the cross. And this is not just a storybook narrative. The way to the cross involves loss, and it involves grief, and it involves fear and temptation and despair, loss of all that we have held dear. You see, the true object of false piety is not love of God and love of the neighbor. False piety has another goal, and this becomes evident as we approach the reality and truth of the cross. So in all the middle of all this stuff, how does the gospel begin? Good news, freedom. How does it break into the world in which we live? It begins not with our reflections or even our reflections. This morning, as always, the gospel begins with Jesus. The gospel begins when the subject changes, when Jesus is the subject. Saving is the verb, and we are the ones being acted upon, the ones in need of his salvation. So what is Jesus doing? Well, after showing us the scribes, Jesus introduces us to a widow Hey, psst, come here. Come here. I want to show you something, he says, as if he's going to show us something important that should stay with us in the months and years ahead. A lesson that we will need on the road to the cross. He takes us to the temple treasury and has us down on a bench across from the offering boxes and shows us a widow. One who is almost invisible to everyone except to Jesus. And now to you. One who, though she is weak, yet she is strong. And he wants to show us something about the nature of true faith, grounded in the power of the cross of Christ. So who is this widow, and what does Jesus want us to see? The widow, the one that Jesus puts in our path this morning, represents everything that the scribes want to avoid. Represents loss of so many things. Loss of her husband. Loss of status. Well, she used to be Mrs. So-and-so, and Mr. So-and-so was, had some wherewithal. That's what she used to be. So she's experienced the loss of her husband, the loss of status, loss of ability to make a living. Loneliness. Anybody here experienced loneliness before? No more parties in which you have the favored seats. People used to invite us. Talk to a widow or a widower, ask them. People used to invite us. No more greetings in the marketplace. People don't seem to recognize you anymore. The widow is all but invisible, but not to Jesus. Jesus sees her, and he points her out to us, though she is unaware, doesn't even know what's happening. Now, it is not clear if Jesus knows the woman. Perhaps he has seen her at the temple in the past, perhaps not. Does she know him? Does she know him? I'm not sure. Maybe not yet. But Jesus is clearly aware of her, perhaps in that way that Jesus has of knowing us and what's going on with us, often even before we ourselves are aware. She may not fully know Jesus yet and his impact on her life, but she clearly lives in the promises of the prophets, the promises fulfilled in most surprising ways by Jesus. I'm almost certain that she knows the story of the widow at Zarephath and the prophet Elijah and the cruse of oil that seemed to never give out. I like that King James cruse, don't you? Cruse of oil. It's not like a little jar, it's a cruse. I like that. Cruse of oil that never, and the small amount of flour sufficient for the day. What an incredible experience. Just every day, I'm going to go out and make a fire. We're going to have a little bread, and then we're going to die. And the next day, by gum, if there isn't some more oil in that cruse. Like the widow, the disciples don't fully know who Jesus is, his fate and his destiny, especially as it impacts them, their fate and their destiny. They don't know him fully, at least not. We do, however. In one sense, we know who he is, and we know how the story turns out after his death and resurrection. At least how it turns out for them, the disciples then. In the lives of those disciples, we know how it turns out. And yet, in another way, we are like this woman. We've heard of Jesus, of the Messiah, and we have heard his promises for us. But we have not experienced him yet fully, at the cross and his resurrection. So in many ways, we are very much like this widow. This woman has faith in what she has heard and not yet seen, at least as far as she knows. She didn't know if she's seen it or not, but her Savior's in the temple with her and with the church this morning. And we are reminded through this widow of the great freedom and power he brings, particularly to those who, though they are weak, yet are they strong. The people who have lost everything. And then, just when we thought that she has nothing left to give to the temple or for the church, nothing to give for maintenance for building projects, Jesus points out something quite different. She actually has give. And though it might be small, it is great. Greater than money. Greater than the treasury itself could hold. The title of this sermon is The Widow's Might, M-I-G-H-T. It's connecting to that old word, I think probably King James, the widow's might, M-I-T-E. Might is little. Might is power. Are they not? Her little 2 coins. Great power. For those who have eyes to see, but not anyone else. Jesus uses the widow herself this morning, though she is unawares, and points her out to us. She didn't put much in the plate in terms of money, but she has put so much more into the treasury. A witness of the power of the cross. She lives with Jesus, or at least the promise of Jesus, until those promises can be fulfilled in her life, until she and Jesus can be fully united. There is a freedom in the life of the widow that is lacking in the life of the scribes. The freedom that comes from knowing the source of her sustenance, even and perhaps especially in the face of dwindling resources. She loses one thing, then she loses another, and she loses another, such as life on the way to the cross. So what is going to support this woman after she gives up her 2 small coins? Remember Paul Harvey? 1, what is going to support this woman? 1, the word of the cross. What is it? It's folly to those who are perishing. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Apostle Paul, 1 Corinthians. Not everyone sees it. To some, maybe it's still invisible. She may not even be aware of it herself. Yet, but to us who are being saved, she embodies the power of God and gives witness to it. 2, what is going to sustain her after she gives up her last 2 coins? We are. Now that we no longer have an incentive to walk around in long robes, and since we have the freedom not to look for the best seats and receive greetings in the marketplace, those are all empty to me now. And since we recognize in the widow the cross of Christ and the cross of the Christian, who though she dies, yet does she live. And we recognize him who binds himself to her and whose cross spells the end of slavery, the end of despair, the end of sadness, the end of loneliness, and the rise of freedom in our own death and condemnation. And are going to pitch in. Since she is still living and active among us, and God still has plans for her. Visit her, visit him, so they are not alone. Say hello to her immediately in the marketplace and seek her out. Don't wait to sing and you realize you haven't said anything. Go seek her out. We are going to invite her to dinner, and we are going to give her the seat of honor at the table. And we're going to say shorter prayers. And to the point, so that she is not bored at the table. A sham piety will not protect you in the raging flood. When all supports are washed away, he then is all my hope and stay. On Christ, the solid rock I stand. All other ground is sinking sand. The word of the cross is the widow's mite. M-I-G-H. And her might. M-I-T-E. Look small, but not to those who have eyes to see. And it's your might too. And that's why we're going to help maintain the widow after she drops in those last 2 coins. And now you know the rest of the story. Good